My name is Stephen Lewarne. I have been dealing with the reconstruction of war-torn economies and with very dilapidated economies really since 1992. I got my PhD, graduated in 92, and then I immediately went over to the Soviet Union. It was still called it down. I went over with the CIA for a 2-year contract as a Canadian. I wasn't an American at the time. I met my wife, who's in the back, who also worked with me there as well, and very instrumental to my work. We dealt with the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was not war-torn, and there's very many differences. But there are some similarities and overlap, such as the governance structure and how to attract foreign direct investment and get them parts of the memberships in international communities like the WTO and the EU and whatnot. But I'm going to focus really on war-torn economies. I'll take you through about 200 years of data at the beginning. There's some very good websites that have existed now and databases on the impact of war and how long it takes to get out of war. Then I'll go through the Marshall Plan in Japan. Why am I doing Marshall Plan in Japan? The reason is that if you read the news and if you go through all of the debates that are going on now for Ukraine and will be going on for Gaza and will be going on, we hope not, but probably for Lebanon, is the Marshall Plan is the one that people look at because it was so much money and it succeeded so well, and same for Japan. I'll then take you through how that has shaped and molded our view of things, particularly in the United States. And let's be frank, up till now and including now, it's the United States that matters. I know you're supposed to say other things, but it's not true. Europe is helpful, Europe is good, but it is contributing money, but it's the Americans that have not only the financial clout, but the military clout, which is behind it. I'll take you through examples of Kosovo, where I was the leader of the reconstruction effort for USAID. My wife was there also as a trainer for the people in from the UN and from on the Kosovar side. We had a very large team in there, and I'll take you through a couple of examples and how that shaped my own approach. And then I'll take you through Afghanistan and Iraq, which I was very heavily involved in. I was the chief economist for the efforts for the U.S. side. And I feel that there was more failures than successes in Afghanistan and Iraq. There were great successes where I worked, but there were lots of failures where everybody else worked. So I'll point that out. And then I'll show how those things are going to shape Ukraine. Let me make a couple of points. So if you're taking notes and then you fall asleep halfway through, here's basically what I'm going to conclude in about a few notes. One is, first of all, the impact of the war. We need to look at the impact of war on economic growth. There are impacts of war on many, many other things, and they're very significant and they can't be overruled. But in terms of what to do and how you can help them rebuild, you need to look at the impacts on economic growth. And what is it that growth means? It's labor, capital, education, technology investments. So the bits and bobs of the utility functions and the production functions that you get in your classes. The second thing to remember is that humanitarian effort is why we start. It's why we want to look at it. We look at a war-torn area, and the first thing that comes to mind is the humanitarian effort that needs to be undertaken. That's what gets the money spent and the votes done. However, the humanitarian effort is not sufficient. It's futile if it's not combined with at the same time, and that is a simultaneity, not in sequence. I've written some abstract papers on this that you don't want to read, but it's about simultaneity of the approach with humanitarian effort. Otherwise, the humanitarian effort will just keep reemerging all the time. In order for reconstruction to work and for it to stick, and I'll go through it with examples here, is one, those funding it have to benefit. And this is something that is often lost, and it was one of the strengths of the Marshall Plan. Secondly, financial stability and public finance have to be restored ASAP. If you don't have a means of exchange, a financial medium by which you can trade, there's simply no way that you can rebuild. And economic agents flounder and they starve. The third is that the local and the national governments have to be the ones who imbibe and use the funds. The Americans and the Europeans can be the source of funds, but as in good accounting classes, there's a source of funds and there's a use of funds. And they both have to be philosophically aligned. Part of the problem that I'll show in Afghanistan in particular was that the Americans, and in Iraq really was bad, the Americans basically took over, and they took over everything, and the local government wasn't really involved. And so when we left, everything collapsed, as we saw. The fourth one is that the private sector is the engine of the growth, and the private sector is the way that the reconstruction effort will survive. But public investment at the very beginning is necessary. The public investment needs to build the roads and the bridges and everything else. And it needs to lay the kernel for private investment. You'll hear some libertarians, some Ayn Randians, whatever, say we don't need any of that. It's not practical. It's a very good argument, but it's not practical. You do need a base infrastructure of operations for it to take off. And then finally, which I will say and show here, there must be an exit strategy for the reconstruction effort. If there isn't an exit strategy, then you get into permanent aid, permanent reconstruction, and incentives go bad. And again, the reconstruction efforts can fail. Afghanistan had no exit strategy, and we saw the result. We can talk about that afterwards if you like. I don't have a long slides on that yet. I can if you want. Maybe you'll do a third lecture if Doug wants me to. I'm happy to. Let's put it in context of the money, first of all. Since 1946, and these are all in 2021 dollars, so we're not playing around with different areas. It's all the same. And when you put it in those dollar terms, you can see how much was spent on the Marshall Plan. But $3 trillion has been spent on aid, exactly $3.14 trillion since 1946. Now, USAID wasn't set up until 1961, but aid was still going out through the Department of State and the military. About $550 billion of that has been spent on the reconstruction of war-torn regimes. That doesn't include military deployments, munitions, weapons, tanks, guns, all that kind of stuff. That's simply aid. So you can see it's a pretty substantial part of the aid effort itself. I don't think many people understand that the United States Agency for Development and State, when they spend their money, about 20%, about a fifth of it is going to the reconstruction of war-torn regimes. That's a pretty big deal, which is why we have so much effort in that area. But I just want you to be aware of the money. And I'll break down this money later on. But this is the kind of dollars we're speaking about. So what I want to talk about, what does a war do to an economy? Now, 200 years of data have come up with, I'm sorry, I boiled a lot of this down over a couple of weeks, and I didn't want to overwhelm Doug with anything. But the main thing here is that some of the conclusions you come to is about half of the countries that we reconstruct, that were reconstructed over the years, go back to war within a decade. So there's a peace declared, within a decade they're back into war. That's a pretty bad average. Very few go back to the previous pre-war levels of per capita income within a decade. And they also have much lower per capita GDP, about 7% lower on average, which is a lot. That's in real terms. That's a pretty big bite. Another thing that happens is, I won't go through this list. I hope you can distribute this, Doug, to the students. But the collapsed financial systems mean that the economic transactions become exceedingly difficult to undertake. If I need medical care and you want eggs, I've got to find eggs, and then I got to find you at the medical care, and you got to find me with eggs, and you can see how it breaks down. That's called a barter economy, or the double coincidence of wants in economics, if you want to look at it that way. That's why we need money. We need financial intermediary, but the money has to mean something. It can't be worthless, like the Weimar and other areas I can speak about. Another thing to think about is that once this happens, once the financial collapse, hyperinflation or high inflation or hyperinflation begin to take hold. If any of you have been doing any economic history or looked at history at all, you look at the Weimar Republic for sure. You can look at Zimbabwe. You can look at Hungary between the wars. You can look at Argentina now at 120% inflation a year. These are all because the currency and the financial systems are collapsing around them. And then, of course, the other thing is the destroyed housing stock, just some very practical aspects. Usually in these wars, we found it in Kosovo especially, the housing stock was completely damaged and completely blown up. And bridges are destroyed, capitals, a lot of the capital is destroyed, networks are destroyed, utilities are broken down. All of this has to be brought back up. One lesson you learn, if you haven't learned it already, if you studied the Civil War in the United States, it took us about 4 years to pretty much destroy the capital in the southern United States between 1861 and 65. The South didn't really rise again for another 100 years. It's easy to destroy stuff. It's pretty hard to build it. That includes knowledge as well, which I can get to afterwards. Another exciting example, which I want to bring up, is Mozambique had a very deleterious civil war. And in their war, 90% of their rolling rail stock. In other words, their transport facility was destroyed, which is a big explanation as to why Mozambique, for all of its wealth, still can't get out of poverty and has never really been reconstructed at all. So who is it impacted? The main issues that come here is that ethnic minorities are almost always the first ones to suffer from the war. And this is why we want to have a public financial mechanism in place in order to spend the money through the budget in order to make sure that they are taken care of. Another one that's clear in this is women, for example, bear most of the brunt, partly because a lot of the men are dead, and they're the only ones left alive. And particularly we're on the losing side. They're subject to rape, enslavement, deportation, and heinous discrimination. In fact, I'll show you in Japan that prior to the MacArthur Constitution, women were in fact property. They were not actually part of production, which was one of the difficulties they had. The loss of human capital is one of the big parts of the war as well. You get a big brain drain. Now in Ukraine, there's about 6.5 million people on the move. Now who moves first, poor or rich? Usually rich. And why are they rich? Usually because they're smarter. Now, we're not a Marxian economy here. We all know that the wealth and the knowledge and the human capital is what builds wealth, and they're the ones that are able to leave. That's a big issue, because when you lose that human capital, you lose your ability to rebuild faster. And then one of the final points I make here without going on is demography. The demographics are really what get destroyed. And if you don't, for example, in the immigration debate, if you think the world's bad with a lot of people, think what the world would be like without enough people in it. Think about the fact that you won't be able to rebuild. And if you look at, for example, in France, Italy, and UK, their populations didn't return after the Second World War for a decade to the level that they were in 1913. That was a real big problem. And it took the United States government to finance that, essentially that gap that was created by the demographic destruction that had occurred. So why do I have this slide here? It's about women, it's about ethnic minorities, about demography. All of this stuff has an impact on growth. Without this, the growth function of an economy can't take place. So we do what we can to fill that in. So that's where we sort of launch off. Just to not forget, the economic reconstruction isn't about paying mortgages in the Virginia area, although many would think it is because of the contracting. That's not it. It's not about simply providing engineers a place to build more things. It's about this. They need to get their demography up, therefore they need their economy to grow. So I want to tell you about the Marshall Plan and why these are the three guys that did it. Marshall's in the middle there, Truman's over there, and that's Roosevelt himself. Now, there were many others. George Kennan is one, Katz is another, Ambassador Grew to Japan. I don't know how many people are in history here or studying World War II history, but it's a fascinating area. And it went well and taught us many things on many levels that are now part of how we view the reconstruction of war-torn regimes. So let's look at why the Marshall Plan succeeded. It had some luck, but the real success of the plan was that the US oversaw all of the funding, but you couldn't get the funding if the national government, like the German governments and the local governments in Germany, or the national governments of France or the local governments in France didn't provide a plan as to how the money was to be used. It wasn't sort of like what aid has become now, where we send over a team, we carpet bomb it with consultants, is what happens, and they have no plan at all from the national governments, and we just start doing our own thing. Those things don't really work. That happened in Afghanistan. Really bad story about that. I'll get to it in a minute. What they did was you don't get money until you have a plan as how it's going to be used, and it has to make sense to us giving you the money. Everybody understood the game in Europe, so they did the game. Secondly, and you'll read this in the stories about the Marshall Plan's history, the Senate was very clear. The United States has to get something out of this. We need to benefit from it. We're not doing this because we want to help, for example, one senator saying the Christian people of Europe, which is what they said. That was only one guy. Most of them were saying, we want a trade partner in Europe. We want to build our exports. We need to get something out of this. And now if you say those things today, they say, well, you're just, we want to make money. You don't really care about it. The fact of the matter is it wouldn't have succeeded if the Americans weren't able to get something out of it, because it wouldn't have passed the House or the Senate, the upper chamber. It also was, the plan funds were monitored for corruption very well in the Marshall Plan, and we can do it again here. Oddly enough, I have to say, Northern Europe had no corruption. All the corruption was Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece, which we saw the collapse when the euro market came up about 10 years ago. In fact, in Greece, they were so bad that the United States Marshall Plan holders cut off the funding to Greece for about a year. And then Greece said, no, crap, we really got to get our stuff together. Stop stealing money. They did. And finally, Greece got back in on the plan. But it was a very hardcore view of it. And again, I would say today that we're much more reluctant to cut off funds because of corruption. It's got to be pretty bad to cut off the money. The approach was very businesslike. It was very much opposed to monopolies and oligopolies, but it wasn't unrealistic. Krupp Armories that supplied the Nazi government with its munitions was allowed to maintain its oligopoly for production after the war because it was in good shape to do so. But for the most part, the Americans spent a pretty hard time making sure that monopolies were disbanded and that private competitive markets could emerge. The other thing I'll finally say about this, other than corruption and competition, was the British pound was still a reserve currency in the world. It was still a currency that you wanted to have. And the Deutschmark, it was the Reichsmark under the Nazis. The Reichsmark was replaced with the Deutschmark, but the Deutschmark was put in place by a central bank. Most of the people of the bank were trained in the US, actually. Everybody spoke the same language, and they knew how to stabilize the currency. So all of these items made the Marshall Plan a willing recipient. There's two more, though, that I will bring up that are more important than even this. One, human capital. The human capital in Europe was very good. It was very, very high. I don't know if any of you have read The Great Influenza, about the 1919 Spanish flu. It's all about German doctors and the medical profession in Europe replanting itself at Johns Hopkins in the United States. Clearly, the human capital in Europe was just as high as the United States. And that was a big help. The other one was the United States had an exit strategy from the Marshall Plan. They said by 1952, we're going to be out. They made it clear to everybody who was receiving funds and using them, they would be out. And so everybody played to the exit strategy. Everybody understood the exit strategy. And also, by the way, it was easier for Americans in the Senate and the House to justify the spending, saying, don't worry, if you're angry, it's going to be over in X number of years. That was a big deal. Exit strategies are one of our biggest problems now when we rebuild, and I'll get to that in a minute. Let's look at the Reconstruction of Japan. The reason I bring that up, it was going on more or less at the same time, a little bit afterwards, but it was important for a number of reasons as well. One, Japan was a far more oligopolistic society. This is a picture, by the way, of MacArthur, American Caesar, if you've read the book, and that's Emperor Hirohito, who was very young. I think he died about 5 years ago. But the lessons here were more or less applied economics as well, and some of them were similar to the Marshall Plan, but not all the same. One was the US had a goal to create a major economic trade ally, the same way they did in Europe. Another one was the new constitution was imposed after the US and British constitutions, and what they did was they demoted the emperor status in the constitution to ceremonial. So they basically brought democracy to Japan through constitutional change. And that was necessary because the power that the emperor exercised in his office, that was a big shift. The US also recognized the harmful discrimination against women. You didn't have this in Europe. Yes, you had traditional cultures in Europe which could be discriminatory, but it wasn't the same thing as in the Constitution. Women were property. They couldn't vote, for example. They couldn't go to work without permission of their husbands. That was all done away with in the MacArthur Constitution. And essentially what they did in that Constitution was it brought in about 50% of the workforce back into the workforce. And this made Japan extremely productive. Japan didn't have troubles with human capital either, obviously not. They were able to launch a war against the US. But like the Marshall Plan, the Reconstruction of Japan also had a clear exit strategy. And finally on this one, the US was in charge. There were no development programs to distract from the Reconstruction. It was, we have a plan. MacArthur was in charge too. That was very different from Europe. And he was a kind of a bully, a strong man, but a popular guy. He'd already basically won the war, although there is the Philippines defeat, but we'll overlook that one. He did a very good job in everything. And he was a belligerent, so he was able to push everything around. And the Japanese were flat on their back. So all of those things played into the structure. But it was essentially like Europe, like the Marshall Plan, spent a little bit less money per capita, but it benefited from the human capital, and they had an exit strategy. So what happened after this was there's a series of reconstruction efforts which go on. I won't go through them all. I've got a book on it you can get on. It's an OECD link. I can send it in this about from the Bosnia, East Timor, Senegal, which is a big one because of the diamond trade. But what happened was there was an emergence of a new world order, and it was allied politics, national governments, and confluence of national interests. Let me show some of the numbers here before I get into some of the other modern day issues. If we look at all of the spending here and what happened was, you can see the money. The amount of money that was spent on the Marshall Plan was $275 billion in 2021 dollars. So clearly it was the most. Japan was 49, but you look at the other big ones and you look at Afghanistan and Iraq. Afghanistan was $120 billion, and that's just for economic reconstruction, not only the military aid. But look what we get out of it. If you can see the GDP growth rate after the plan. This is 10 years after each of the plans. Europe was 7%, Japan 10%. And then you have Afghanistan, it had a negative 2.4%, and Iraq had no growth at all. And Kosovo and the Balkans had only a 2% growth. Now, you could do a lot of discussion and studies on what that meant. I would say, without spending too much time on it, one was the level of human capital available, which should make you think about how much you spend and when you spend it and where you spend it. The second one was there was a permanent aid industry established after the Marshall Plan in Japan. So they had an interest in staying and not necessarily doing everything they should. I do have numbers here on Ukraine, which I'll do more of later on. We're spending about $15 billion a year. That doesn't include the military. And we're trying to leverage the human capital. We're learning a lot from what we made in mistakes in last efforts and trying to revive the Marshall Plan approach. So let me go to evolution of war. I hope I can do this correctly. So here we are in 1947. And this is where most of the reconstruction was taking place. You can see the big bubbles over here. All this stuff here is the reconstruction of Europe and, of course, the reconstruction of Japan. You go forward, and by 1955 or so, you can see how it was starting to move down, move out. They were still putting a lot in Japan, but I forgot to mention the reason why Japan was so successful was they had a kind of Keynesian stimulus in that the Korean War began in 1950. And when the Korean War began in 1950, Japan was the launching base for everything. So that was a huge stimulus to the Japanese economy. And of course, I've got it here on 1955. And so you can see that they were still benefiting from the war in Korea and the reconstruction programs in Korea itself. But Japan was the one that was the main base of operations. You go forward here to see if we go to when I started in Kosovo. And you can see where the focus is going now. It's shifting down to the Middle East. It's shifting down to the Balkans. Africa still hasn't become the big player it has because PEPFAR under George Bush, which was a good program, mind you, hadn't really come into effect. You move up here to, 2016, and you can see how the concentration in the Middle East and Africa takes over almost everything. And you can see Afghanistan is one of the big recipients of aid. And then you move up to today, and of course, what do you see? The big bubble getting bigger on Ukraine, right? Very, very large. And of course, Africa is taking much more resources out of it. So that's something to think about and gives you a context of how aid has evolved. We've gone from, essentially from this to this, if that makes sense. I thought it was a good visual. So, what happened was after 1992, when the Soviet Union broke up, a holy trinity in reconstruction emerged. Donors, which is USAID. Remember that. I hope you guys apply for jobs there when you graduate. They have openings. Talk to Doug. Second one is the national governments themselves. They learned under the Marshall Plan that they had to be participants in it, and they started to have a voice in it. And then the private sector, as I said. If the private sector wasn't involved or wasn't key to the operation, then it wasn't going to survive. So the major lessons we take out of it then, it's much easier to destroy capital. The evidence of suffering due to housing infrastructure is where we want to focus first, along with humanitarian aid. It's important to rebuild the country so the most talented want to come back. And a major point that I've already said the exit strategy, is that you need to wrap these war-torn countries into a greater community. In other words, when you rebuild a war-torn country, you've got to wrap them into, Ukraine's case, the European Union and NATO. In the case of Afghanistan, we wanted to wrap them into the WTO. The case of Central Asia, when we were there, they were war-torn, but they were kind of flat on their back. They were new countries. We focused so heavily on the World Trade Organization to bring them in. Without that, you don't have much. And what's a bit disturbing now in the modern discussion that's going on is we have this, since Trump came into office, a lack of focus on multilateral trade. It's about bilateral trade, and we can produce stuff ourselves. You're never wealthier if you're producing stuff yourself. Trade is good. Trade is what we want, and it's the fastest way to growth in addition to these other things. I think those are lessons that have to be learned. That also means you have to create a government which can play and be responsible on the international market, in the international community. That's a big effort. What I want to do is give you an example of one of the most, it was kind of humorous, but it was also dangerous. When I was head of the Kosovo reconstruction effort, we had a problem. The biggest problem we had was that there was no financial stability there. We needed to encourage growth, but we sat down with the IMF sat down with us. They were the ones who came up with the idea. And the IMF is usually in charge of these meta issues on finance, for example, because they're good and they're small and they move fast. They came to us, myself as a monetary economist, and also the European Commission, and said, we don't think the Kosovars should have their own currency. Every country I've gone into that wants to reconstruct, say, if they're new, we want our own currency with our own historical leaders on the bills, and it becomes a nationalistic issue. And my advice is always, no, take the dollar. You should use the dollar. You can use the dollar. You don't need permission to use the dollar. You don't have to ask the Central Bank of the United States. You can use the euro or the Deutschmark. You don't have to ask permission. In fact, the European Union, the Deutschmark, Germany, United States, if you use their money, they get a seigniorage revenue out of it, which I won't go into, but they get money out of it if you use their currency. So we said, no, you're going to use the Deutschmark. The euro didn't exist yet. It wasn't coming in until 2001. So we did that. Suddenly prices stabilized. When you take the dollarized, you take another country's money, you import their interest rates and you import their inflation, with the exception of supply inflation. If there's bridges blown up, then prices can go up. You get the bridge fixed, eventually you get down to the level of inflation that you import the currency from. That was all great, everything was fine, and we sat back, smoked a cigarette, thought we'd done a good job. 3 weeks later, we found that there was chaos and kerfuffles in the markets, on the streets. People were mad, they were going to throw Molotov cocktails into our building. I didn't want that, and what was the reason? There were only high denomination Deutschmarks. It would be like having 150s if you tried to survive on campus here, and everybody had no change for 100 and no change for 50s, and merchants couldn't operate. So we went, oh my God, we're really in, that's not actually the words we used, but we said we're in trouble here. So we phoned the Central Bank of Germany, and they had already committed to put millions of dollars worth of money into the Kosovo economy, help it grow. And we said, why don't you put that into small bills? It's like a drug deal, but give us 1, 3, 5, and 20 Deutschmark notes. That's what we need. And we need to have those fast. And so it'll take a couple months. And we don't have a couple months. We need to do this in a week. So a guy named Alan Pearson and I and others, we got together and we got them to pledge millions of Deutschmarks in small bills. Now, this takes up a lot of space, if you can imagine. So we had to fly in 2 747s into Skopje, the capital of Macedonia, because we couldn't fly it into Kosovo. The airport wasn't big enough, and we were afraid that Serbian fighters might shoot it down. So 2 747s came in. There were no people on them. There was a pilot, obviously, but there were no people on them. Every seat had a bag of 150 pounds of Deutschmarks in small bills, with Deutsche Bank on the outside. And we couldn't get the US military to take us from Kosovo to Macedonia to pick it up because they said, we'll help you, but if we get a call to go quell a Serbian conflict, or we get called to war somewhere up in the north, we just leave you guys on the side of the road with $100 million worth of money, right? That'd be great. So we got the Greeks, who weren't doing anything anyway. And so the Greeks took us over to Macedonia, and then we had to have a heavier military help us, and that was the Ukrainians, in fact, Ukrainians and the Russians. They have these big troop transporter helicopters that can move something like 50 men at a time or whatever they are. We had 3 of those. So we got the Ukrainian and the Russians to help us unload all of these bags of money from the plane, and we put them onto the troop carriers, and they said, what is this? And of course we couldn't tell them, we weren't allowed to. We said, it's food aid, and they said, well, why does it say Deutsche Bank on the bag? And we said, well, it's going to be food aid, just put it on the thing. So all the helicopters got filled, we flew them into the Pristina airport, we took it to the central bank vault in Kosovo in downtown, and these big doors, it's the old style, big doors, and there were 2 keys, and they're this long, and you have to insert them at the same time, separately. One has to do one, I had to do the other. And if you do it wrong, it'll blow up. Now, it won't blow up on you, but the lock will blow up, and you'll just have this case you can't get into. We put the keys in together, and we opened it up, and suddenly the bank vault opened, like on a Ocean's 11 or whatever. We put the money in, we packed it up, and we were then. And an interesting sidebar, this in the inflationary story, was the money in the corner, there were like 300 million dinars, Serbian dinars in the corner. So we burned that money, actually. And then we took the dollar, the Deutschmark packets, and then we distributed them through the commercial banks, which had been set up by our team as well. And within a few days, all the chaos began to calm down. But you can see the practical sides of this. This had nothing to do with PhD in economics. In fact, the PhD probably got in the way. I should have thought about the fact that you actually have to trade stuff, you know. It was very stressful, and it also relied on the charity of a wealthy country called Germany. And it was a very, very, thin edge of the wedge kind of operation. It was, but it worked out okay, thankfully, because I didn't want to have my office blown up. So, okay, so that's just an example of financial stability in its real terms. Let me go to ending up here more or less, Afghanistan and Iraq. And in my view, we sort of backtracked in some respects. The first thing was our recent experience in Afghanistan and Iraq are very much informing how we're going to rebuild Ukraine. Particularly some of the mistakes. One that was clearly on display was the American arrogance in Iraq with something called the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA. I don't know if you've studied it or not yet. But it was set up to run Iraq, and it really didn't involve many Iraqis. The other thing they did was they disbanded the army when they arrived. So they said, the Iraqi army is now illegal. This is part of our reconstruction effort. Where do you think trained military personnel go when they're illegal? They go to the other side. So that's when we had the green zone and the red zone. And the green zone was where the Americans were, and the red zone was where the Iranians were firing rockets into. And all the bad guys could have been good guys, but we fired them. That wasn't, well, the US did. The second thing that went on in Afghanistan in particular and in Iraq was NGOs. I don't know if you've heard of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or CSOs, called civil society organizations. They moved in and took over because of the weak government structure. And they actually became really the governments. They became the public financial management operators for most of the outlying rural areas. They replaced the government in a sense. And that meant there was very little control from Kabul and very little control from Baghdad, so much so that Erbil in the north broke off. This was a problem because if you don't have governmental control and you're trying to rebuild a unit, you have to have control over it, and that is particular over the public finances. The next thing that happened was we managed to get the currency under control in Afghanistan through a currency auction, which is what we did with the IMF again, where we had a Dutch auction and we would announce the rate, and that stabilized their currency, and we fixed it to the dollar. I would have preferred that they accepted the dollar, but they didn't want that. In Iraq, they didn't listen to us, but it wasn't the Iraqis. The Iraqis wanted it. The commercial bankers did. It was the Americans that said, no, we'll handle this on our own. Of course, they couldn't handle it on their own. So within about 6 months after, with the dinar moving way down in economics, right? Way down. We flew in, our team, and we worked with the IMF to stabilize the currency in Iraq. The problem there was once we got it all stabilized, we did it. It was me and I was the main one. The main one was the IMF with these huge teams, and we were all working together. And then we left. And then nobody knew how to do it. So the currencies began to collapse again, and that was a really bad thing. And with both Iraq and Afghanistan, there was virtually no exit strategy whatsoever. It was a permanent aid game. And the only reason we pulled out of Afghanistan the last time was, Obama was trying to get out, couldn't find a way. Thankfully, sort of just chilled upon it. Trump wanted to as well, didn't. And then Biden, for political reasons at home, he had to get out. And there's a way to do it and their way isn't. But we hadn't. I'm not really blaming him for all of that, but I am saying that all of them were in a pickle because when we started the whole thing, we never thought about how to get out of it. That was a bad thing, and that has to be something that we don't want to have. We don't want to have happen again. Let me just look at one last issue. Can you see why this matters a lot? If you look at this is from the Congressional Research Office. Afghanistan's takeover ended in about 2010. In other words, the military takeover ended in 2010. Yet, if you look at this chart, Afghanistan was eating up more and more and more resources 5 years after we ended the campaign. The reason for that is we weren't doing our job in reconstruction efforts, and the human capital wasn't good enough to take over. So there was virtually no growth. There was negative growth, actually, as I showed you. And then what you see is more and more resources are being eaten up on a place that we were supposed to have already invaded and reconstructed far earlier than even Iraq. Iraq was doing okay because they had oil, basically. But that's not really an excuse. So let me finish off, and a lot of this will be the topic of what I discuss next week on Ukraine and some of the major areas that we want to look at here. The primary issue is for Ukraine and what we've learned. National governments have to be involved, and they're the ones that have to articulate their plans and how they're going to use the funds. Human capital is very important, but it's really much more important now for Ukraine to get the human capital to come back. Now, that's a complicating issue, because if the European Union says, it's going to take you a decade to get in, there's a 25-year-old Ukrainian who just emigrated that does coding in France, why the hell would I go back? Right? And the other one is NATO. They're bemused and they're saying we can't have you part of NATO now, but we don't exactly know when. So great. Russia will come to the table and say, oh, okay, we'll leave you alone for a while. But if they're not part of NATO, they'll just harass them again. And everybody understands that. Again, why would you go back? Those are the two issues which need to be addressed when the reconstruction happens. Public finance has to be addressed. Now, they're doing that now, and that's one of the things I'll be doing when I go over to Ukraine. But the private sector also has to be key in it. It's going to cost $1 trillion. Again, I'll break these money down for you next week. There's going to be $1 trillion. The donors don't have $1 trillion to spend in the next 5 years on Ukraine. So that has to come from the private side. That means we have to create an investment environment for foreign direct investment to flow in. That means legal and regulatory regimes have to be focused on. And the last thing I'll say, without going through all of this, is that trade is essential. They have to become part of the WTO, or they have to be re-emphasize the WTO and the European Union. And we need an exit strategy. We have to say to the Ukrainians, we're done in X time and there's no more money on it. Those are the themes. So thank you very, very much for listening.
It's working? Perfect. Steve, thank you very much. So, by the way, you just received a master class that would normally take maybe 2 semesters or 4 years in 45 minutes. So, as Mark Twain said, if I'd had more time, I would have written it shorter. So, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
There are times, you can get a free shot at Dr. Lewarne on anything dealing with reconstruction or economics. But I have one question maybe to start things off. You mentioned the importance of human capital. is it worth our while even trying to invest in reconstruction in places like Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's come up now more and more. I only actually really started to think about it when I was looking at the metadata on this. Actually, nobody's really looked at the metadata on this. So thanks for inviting me. Otherwise, nobody would have looked at it, Doug. But that's a question. Do we just have humanitarian efforts, or do we just have a military effort? Interestingly enough, my wife doesn't know this, but her father was a wing commander in the U.S. Air Force and a decorated. He was the one who said to me on Afghanistan, well, why don't we just, when we went in, I said, yeah, then we have to rebuild. And he said, why? Go in, accomplish what you want, and then leave. And if they misbehave, go back again. And if they misbehave, go back again. And I thought at the time, nah. Now I'm thinking, maybe that's not the bad model. Because if you look at it, if you discipline them in a certain way through getting rid of the governments that you don't like because they're harboring terrorism, but you leave them on their own to build, they may do a better job. Research has to go into that. But I really would say that if the level of human capital, which we know it when we see it, is low or high, that is really a signal as to how much time and effort you should put into the economy itself. The problem with that starts to separate it away from the humanitarian effort, right? Because if the human capital is high or low, you still want to make sure that they're not dying in droves and there's not genocide. So it's a very difficult issue. But I would say, frankly, I'm trending towards there should be whole new reconstruction efforts for what are deemed low human capital versus high human capital. Yeah.
The other question I have is, I'm not an economist, but is there a way to measure human capital? So I kind of know it when I see it. So you mentioned the software coder, the engineer, lawyers are probably not so much. But how do you measure human capital?
Well, the World Bank, the World Index on Capital has a human capital side, and they have a measurement process by how many years of education, how much STEM goes into an operation, what kind of levels of reading are achieved within the language of the country. So there is a way to measure the index of human capital. The Soviet Union, for example, has very high human capital because every student could do maths by grade 10 and calculus by grade 8. In fact, there were the stories last year about Ukrainian students in French schools who thought their grade 10 counterparts were so stupid because the French couldn't do math. And the Ukrainians were just sailing ahead in all the math, and they were getting frustrated. So, but those are the building blocks. That doesn't necessarily mean the governance is good. That doesn't mean they're going to apply their human capital well. That's a whole way of managing your legal and regulatory structure. But you need the human capital in place. But yes, there are measurements of human capital. It's years of education. So,
okay, questions from the floor?
Well, Dr. Lewarne, thanks for coming out and giving us such a great presentation. I'm curious about what you have to say about Erbil in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. You mentioned how it broke off from the rest of Iraq. Franciscan has a relationship with the university over there, and I know just from some friends that are over there that there's significant private investment in that area, and I'm curious what you have to say about the current situation there as opposed to maybe the rest of Iraq or the Middle East.
One thing the Erbil did was when it broke off, it didn't break off willy-nilly. They didn't decide they're just going to leave. Now, they always wanted to leave because Saddam Hussein treated them so badly. But they put their oil and gas revenue machinery into place. They knew their reserves to production ratio. They knew their total explored reserves, their total potential reserves. They knew their markets very well, and they knew the pipelines through back to get it out to the Black Sea and then to the Mediterranean. And they had that stuff sewn up pretty well. So when they separated, I think they were something like 300,000 or 400,000 barrels of oil a day. And that was revenue that went right into their fisc, and they were able then to basically run a government. Don't forget, Erbil also had consensus and still does. It's not a fractured ethnic society. So, if people like, white colored roads or whatever, nobody's going to debate the fact that they wanted a black color road because that's what I want. Everybody sort of agreed that the infrastructure was what they wanted, and there was no debating over that. The problem that they have, of course, is the Kurdish incursions across the Turkish border and the Kurdish national governments abroad. It's probably the largest irredentist population in the world, right? They don't have a vote anywhere, and yet they're a country, and they act like one. I think Turkey doesn't help at all, and they're certainly not sympathetic to Erbil or the Kurds. And Baghdad now is slipping back into its pre-Iran-Iraq war operations and the way they view things, and I think it's only going to get worse for the Kurds. I would, frankly, I would short Erbil. I'm not optimistic about it, to be honest with you. The oil and gas, sure, but that can always be blown up, right? So I think the Kurdish, it's the larger Kurdish national discussion which matters. And I think for answers on that, I don't have all the answers, but I think you need to look to Turkey as the main driver of the success of Erbil in the long run, actually.
What would the main export of Ukraine be for the world economic trading market outside of oil, and how would their re-entrance to the global market be beneficial to the United States?
Well, the first thing is the biggest export of Ukraine is grain, right, or was grain. They don't really export much oil. What their problem was in the East was getting that oil production to a point where they didn't need to import any power. But most of their power actually comes from nuclear energy, actually. They need to get that back up. And the Europeans have to get off this green thinking that nuclear power is bad. I don't know why it's bad, because it doesn't produce any CO2, but anyway, it's an idiotic argument. But Ukraine has one of the most advanced nuclear power operations in the world. Their exports are grain, what are they called, minerals, lithium, what's the critical minerals? What? Rare earth minerals. They have got more location of lithium per capita than almost any country in the world. Don't forget, this place is bigger than Texas, right? It's not trivial. So the main benefit to the United States is if they can get, well, it's not a benefit to the U.S. farmer, but if the Ukraine grain can get out to the markets, it's going to relieve a lot of the humanitarian efforts around the world, because that grain then can feed people through the Suez, which is where most of their grain went to distribute to Africa. And the other part is their biggest export, I predict, their biggest export in value terms is going to be artificial intelligence, cyber, and basically digital operations. They'll be able to export that knowledge, and they already were prior to the war. But that's what's going to become the valuable part of it. I don't know if I answered your question. There's other things they export which are really valuable, but those are the main ones.
Thank you for a really good presentation. I had a question about the use of funds. I'm looking at my notes here. The use of funds specifically in terms of political corruption. So I'm wondering if, sort of the example of Greece with the Marshall Plan, that's still a European, broadly, Greece is still kind of European culture. And I'm sort of thinking in terms of radically different cultures, and then Japan being obviously the big success story, but it seems to take MacArthur's authoritarian personality to make it work. So I'm wondering if the extent to which you have a radically different culture where what seems to us corruption is for them the way of doing business, does that necessarily require a McCarthy-style leadership, or MacArthur-style leadership, which we may not have the ability to do anymore?
McCarthy wouldn't work. MacArthur would be very, very good, yeah. I don't think that there's been a lot of discussion on corruption. Again, political scientists look at this because the cross-cultural issue is a big deal. Is it corrupt or not? I think we've settled on that corruption is a mono standard, not a dualist standard. If you're taking our money, you're going to spend it the way our taxpayers who voted to have this money go spent. That means you do what's known as a PIFA, a public expenditure financial assessment, PIFA. And it looks at what you said your budget would do, what you said your expenditure functions would do, and how it's going to go and where it's going to go. That is cross-cultural. And if you're going to argue that case so much, then you can't have our money, right? So, I mean, is it arrogant? I don't know if it's arrogant, but you have to tell these places. This is actually no different than when I gave advice on monetary policy and how to tame inflation in Central Asia, or in South Sudan, which I had the worst time at. Oh no, you think things operate different here. Water runs uphill in this country. Well, no, water actually runs downhill everywhere in the world. Doesn't matter where you are. It's the same with corruption. So I think I'm not playing down the point. I think what's happened is that question's been asked a lot, and I think the World Bank's corruption index lays down what corruption is, why it would occur, and then how to avoid it, and it's pretty much across all operations. Now, can you give somebody more time to come on board? Can you give them, the way the WTO says you can have your corrupt tariff in place to protect your steel industry for another 5 years as opposed to 1 year? Sure, you can do that if you're willing to tolerate it. But I think the real core answer to your question is that corruption is not cross-cultural, if that makes sense. You may not agree, but that's what I've seen.
I have a question, another one. So if a Franciscan student wants to get involved with Reconstruction, is the best route to go work for USAID? And how does a student prepare oneself for a career there?
Well, there's lots of ways to do it. One is, we'll start from the beginning. If you can't write, you're of no use to anybody. So please focus on your writing, because if you can't write, nobody's going to hire you. That means that you don't have to do a lot of things. You don't have to become a math major, or you don't have to become an accountant or whatever. But you must have the ability to write, think, and analyze. And that means doing strategy. It also means looking at the websites and liaising with the companies that do this development work. And there's lots of them. And they're all online. They'll always speak to you or build up connections. We can work on that, actually, if you want. We can work on your students having a conduit to the Commonics of the world, a big aid provider. Development Alternatives, one of my favorite firms. Deloitte, Pricewaterhouse, E&Y, they all recruit on campuses. Now that's kind of up to you to bring them on, but you guys should meet them. But hone your skills, understand the ability, make sure you have the ability to analyze a problem. Reading the classics once in a while wouldn't hurt, because you gotta kind of know those things, despite what everybody says. And then look at what it is that first-year consultants do right out of college, out of school. If Georgetown students can go to Deloitte out of college, so can you. So how did they do it? They did it by understanding what the firm does, what the firm's mission was. Study the 10 companies you'll apply to as to what it is they want to do. What is it that they look at? Most of you, to be honest with you, should learn R and Java as well, because if you don't know R and Java, then the companies, they might want you, but they have less use for you than not. And you're young enough now that you can learn R in several months, and then you're off to the races. That's the only really technical thing I would say. R and Java are pretty significant to know. But become a good writer and understand the companies that are offering aid. And we can certainly work on that. I can't give you the list now, but I can give you the operation.
Hi, you mentioned that President Obama and Trump both wanted to get out of the aid with Afghanistan, but they were kind of stuck because there was no exit strategy implemented in the first place. So I'm curious as to how we would implement that strategy and how long it would take for there to be like the least amount of resistance, and to just, to do what's best for us in those situations.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have an answer. I mean, it's a good question. It's a complex question, because one answer is that we never should have gotten involved in the first place. Now, there are people on left and right in the United States on Iraq that say, for example, we were wrong in Iraq, that we had them controlled in a no-fly zone. And as Bill Maher said, Saddam Hussein was basically the mayor of Baghdad when that was going on. He was pretty much contained. But how is it that you would do it? The first thing is to be clear about how long you're going to be there. Set the time frame first, as opposed to we're going to be here to get the job done. Well, that doesn't really mean much. How long are you going to be here, and when are you going to draw down? And then the second part is, after a little while, you have to realize, are you going to be fighting a forever war? Because you're simply not going to solve these ethnic disputes. And then you either have to ramp down fast, or you have to make the case that we're going to be permanently in place. If you do that permanent in place, you're into a very different discussion from Reconstruction. You're into permanent running of a government. No, nobody really wants that. So it would have been good if when Bush went in, and then Obama later, I'm not blaming any of these guys, but what they might have done in retrospect is define the number of years, define the funds, and then let everybody know it's going to run out. You've always got the other side that says the enemy will just wait you out then, right? It's a complex question. I don't really have an answer, except that an exit strategy announced is better than not having one at all, because then you can play to some final game. Great. Thanks, guys.